words, not mine. Do you know how frustrating it is to have to translate everything in my head before I say it? To have people laugh in my face because I'm struggling to find the words? You should try talking in my shoes from 1 mile.
I think you meant.
I know what I meant to mean. Do you even know how smart I am in Spanish? Of course you don't. For once, it would be nice to speak to someone in my own language, in my own home.
There's a line that she says at the end there. She says, "Do you even know how smart I am in Spanish?" That is, it's a funny line. It's meant to be funny, but it's actually very heartbreaking. She feels trapped. She can't express herself always the way she wants to. And if you watch the show, her English is actually very, very, very good. But there are times where she does say the wrong thing, and it doesn't really impede communication. But in certain situations, when you're looking for the exact correct word, she has problems, and she feels a little trapped inside herself. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about with this. I think it's just a really interesting phenomenon, like I said, and for someone like myself, I started learning Spanish as an adult. So I know exactly what it's like to be a language learner and to be very conscious about your use of the second language. All right, so first, since we're talking about the language ego, we might as well start all the way back with this gentleman who is this? All right, Sigmund Freud, our friend Dr. Freud. He founder of psychoanalysis, but what he gave us that we still actually use today is this idea, the model of the psychic structure, which has 3 parts. Does anyone know what they are?
Ego,
The ego, the superego, and the id. All right, so there we go. All right, so now we've got the names, thanks to Joe and Brian. Let's see if we can figure out which is which. Okay, so one of these parts, the instinctual and impulsive part, the source of our needs, wants, desires, and drives. All right, then one part is the critical and moralizing part. It requires us to perfectly follow the rules, the social norms, and helps us understand what is right and what is wrong, and it imposes guilt. So we try to do what is right. And then the third part is the part that it mediates, represents reason, reality, and common sense. All right, let's see. So letter A, instinctual and impulsive, the source of our needs, wants, and desires, and drives. Which part is that? Do you remember? All right, it's been a while since we've had psychology class. Yeah, that's the id. So that is, it's primitive. It's whatever we want. It's our drive and our feelings. All right, letter B, the other side, the opposite side, critical and moralizing, follow the rules. All right, the superego. There we go. And then so what is in the middle of the ego? This is what tries to mediate what is happening between the id and the superego. All right, so we'll take this now. So when we're talking about the ego, first of all, just so there's no confusion, we're not talking about this at all. Those are egos. We're talking about this part of the brain here. And this is from Freud now, summarizing what the ego does. It's driven by the id, but it's confined by the superego. So it struggles in bringing about harmony among the forces and influences working in and upon it. And it readily breaks out in anxiety. There's different kinds of anxiety. Realistic anxiety regarding the external world, moral anxiety regarding the superego, and neurotic anxiety regarding the strength and the passions in the id. This is all from Freud. So our ego, which is trying to balance the superego and the id, uses defense mechanisms. So it uses denial, displacement, rationalization, regression, suppression, dissociation to cover up, to hide these incongruencies with the id's behavior and our own expectations. And our own expectations are driven by the superego. The ego also is where we have our intellectual cognitive functions and our interpersonal skills. And today the ego usually is referring to self-esteem. So this is what we're going to take into our language learning situation as we talk about this idea of the language ego. And this term was coined by Professor Alexander Giora in the early 70s, who studied linguistics and psychology. And so this language ego idea focuses on the relationship between language and cognition, and between language and our personality, and how we behave and how we present ourselves. If we use language as the means to express ourselves in any situation, then the language is really representing who we are. So it's this integration between our internal processes, our thoughts, and our emotions, and then this external method, the speech, that we have of representing ourselves. And according to Dr. Giora, although language ego does include these other systems, language systems like grammar and lexis, he thought when he presented this idea, this theory, that it really focused on pronunciation. And so if we focus a little more on pronunciation, it often is the most difficult aspect of a different language to perfect. This is why we all have accents when we try to speak other languages. Most of us, especially when we learn at an older age. It is interestingly, I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but this is the most difficult part of your own language to lose. No one will ever, almost in any situation, will be considered a non-native speaker of their native language. So even if you have, it says dysfunctions or impairments, no one will ever mistake me, for a non-American English speaker. According to him, this is also the most difficult thing to change, the most difficult part of our behavior. So individual differences in the ability to approximate native-like pronunciation should reflect individual differences in the flexibility of the psychic processes or the empathic capacity. So this brings us to empathy, this idea not related just to pronunciation, but also the overall capacity to acquire a second language and to incorporate a new system of communication. So now we're getting to the idea, we're blending this idea of my being able to communicate and the factors that are prohibiting me from communicating exactly how I want to. So he says second language acquisition in all its dimensions demands that the individual, to a certain extent, incorporate a new identity. And this is something now as language teachers we're starting to see often when we have curriculums and we have exams and we have to meet deadlines and we have tests and things like this. This idea gets left off because this is something that is difficult to quantify in an objective way. Whereas I can give a test and I can give a student an A or a B. In this situation, helping my student identify in a different way, in a more comfortable way in this new language is a personalized thing, which means teachers have to work with every individual student. But like I said, it's also an abstract thing. So it makes things a little more complicated in the classroom. So when we learn a new language, we have to not only learn a lot of vocabulary and grammar and pronunciation, but we should probably combine this with the idea of the culture of the language we're speaking. And when we're talking about English, it's a little tricky because English is now reflected in many different cultures. But it is this idea of no longer assuming the identity of my own home culture. So I want to express myself in a different language, and I have to understand how that language is used to express the feelings or the thoughts that I want to express. And that's where things get very, very complicated. So what happens is we need to develop a new identity that allows us to function in this new system. This is a very, very rudimentary example, for instance. But in English, although we have lots of really fun turns of phrases and we can say really cute things, if we talk about this idea of love in English, I think our lexical options are limited. Let's say we meet someone for the first time and we decide we like this person. And then eventually we develop stronger feelings and we love this person. And it's kind of it. Like we like and then we love. And in Spanish, the degrees of liking are much more gradual and much more, there are more of them. So for instance, if you say I like you in the literal translation of Spanish, me gustas, you've already jumped to a very profound emotional state. So before that, you have all these other phrases, me caes bien, me agradas, and you go through this walking up this emotional ladder to finally get to the words like te quiero or te amo, these loving emotions. And if you don't understand how that culture views this and how the culture approaches this and then expresses this, it creates a hurdle when you want to express yourself in that language because it's all culturally related. Like I said, it's a very, very basic, rudimentary example using the language. But you're creating this new identity in order to express yourself in the language. Oh no. Oh, there's. So when we create this new identity, we're experiencing life in this new socio-cultural world. We start thinking, socializing, and behaving differently than we do, and then how we behave with the people of our home culture. And so our communication has to reconcile this idea of the new language, this new operating system, and this sense of belonging. And so what happens is we find ourselves kind of in between these two ideas. And this is something that happens to our students. This is something that as a language learner living in Mexico that I have discovered about myself. And it was something that was difficult for me to understand at first because my personality in functioning in Spanish is actually different than it is functioning in English. And in a very common way, when I'm in a Spanish situation, I have realized, especially with lots of people, with large groups of people, that I am more closed, I am shyer, I am less willing to express a lot of ideas because I feel limited. And it's something I didn't understand the change in personality that was happening to me until I realized that it had to do with my desires to express myself in a language, in a culture that were foreign to my native language and my native culture. So this idea, do you even know how smart I am in Spanish, I think perfectly sums up what is happening and what happens to our students many times in our classrooms. And we're going to talk about this, remembering that in my experience, I'm approaching this from the point of view of students living in a non-English speaking country. And here we're approaching it in a different point of view. So now, the learner's language ego. Will the language ego, this new personality that we're trying to develop in our learner, will this raise or will it lower their inhibitions? And this is something that we have to address in the classroom then. So, I don't want to do this. There you go. Okay, so this idea of ego boundaries. What is preventing us from leaving our native space, psychological and expression space, and venturing out into a new space? This is an ego function. This is something that the ego does that helps us keep our identity out of fear of losing it to a new situation. So it kind of closes us off, so we don't lose who we think we are. So ego boundaries in general, let's see here. There we go. This is something that changes depending on the situation. It's variable.
If you press the button that's on your back, there's a button right on the back of it, it's like a reset.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, so when we extend our ego boundaries, we are active participators in this new situation, this new context, and we feel comfortable. We're trying to assimilate, we're trying to be a part of this, the psychological and cultural and expressionistic environment. And when we contract our ego boundaries, we shut down, because we start thinking about how we are unsuccessful in expressing ourselves. This is not always a bad thing. And so this is something that will happen in our students, and we have to realize that they need this. Just like in the very beginning of language learning, they need a silent period. They need to be able to process and think, and it's not dead time. Their minds are actually working. In this case, it's the same thing. Our students, it seems like they shut down, but what is happening is that they're using this time to develop new strategies. They're trying to figure out how to succeed in the situation, and that's okay to a certain extent. But at some point, we have to motivate our students to participate in a way that's productive for them, and so we'll get to that. And when we talk about ego boundaries and we talk about boundary thickness, or we could use the term permeability too, this is how willing we are to want to venture outside of our comfort zone in this new language and this new culture. So thin boundaries are good for learning situations because it means I want to try, I'm less focused on failure. But often when we feel uncomfortable or we feel insecure, we create these thicker boundaries. So if we want to make these boundaries more permeable, allow us to go from our original personality, if you will, into a new idea with a new culture and a new language, we want to enhance this permeability, this idea to venture outside of who we think we are. All right, so first of all, we have to lower inhibitions in our students. We have to make our students feel comfortable in the learning situation, and we have to help them on this road to empathy, this idea of understanding the new culture, understanding this new method of expression, and embracing it, and understanding that it doesn't change who we are as a person, or it won't change it in a negative way. And so what you see here, because we're talking about language ego and now we're talking again about empathy, empathy is actually influenced by the ego permeability, which means we have now come full circle in everything. Talking about the language ego, permeability, empathy, and inhibitions. It all is working together. All right, so what does this mean? This is, I think for many teachers, this is a really, really great takeaway. Intelligence, motivation, and skill are not the only factors involved in learning a new language. We have to take into consideration the affective factors, how a student feels, their emotions, their motivation, their self-esteem in the learning situation. So it isn't just about cognitive factors, which makes language teaching even more complicated for many teachers who are focused on curriculum, they're focused on deadlines, they're focused on scores, they're focused on tests. We have to understand that these factors, these affective factors, are personalized, they're psychological, and they're difficult to quantify. But we do have to help develop them for the sake of our students. Like I just said, we often overlook them because we're busy doing other more objective types of activities in our class. Often this is considered non-scientific and subjective. And so this brings us to more theory. Stephen Krashen and all his wonderful theories from the late 70s, one of the hypotheses that he came up with is this effective filter hypothesis. And the way he phrased it, I think, is very helpful. The effective filter is a block to learning. So when the effective filter is raised, which is the terms that we use, students are prevented from learning easily. And when the effective filter is lowered, students feel more comfortable and more at ease, and learning happens more easily. So according to him, we have three categories of affective variables. We have this motivation factors. So students with higher motivation do better, and students actually with lower motivation, first of all, not only do they not seek as much input, they're less connected to the learning situation. But if they're unmotivated and they receive the input, they understand, process, and retain it at a lower degree. So keeping our learners motivated, developing their self-confidence, giving them a good self-image, telling them that they can learn, that there's no harm in learning, and that there are no negative aspects to the learning situation. And then helping lower their anxiety, making them feel comfortable, and then making them understand this situation of language learning. So to put it into in a little diagram here, I have my comprehensible input, which is another term we get from Krashen. Whatever input I'm giving my students to help them learn the language. So it could be visual, it can be reading, it could be a video, it could be vocabulary, whatever it is, but it's information to help my student develop their language ability. And so my student takes this information and they put it into this mechanism, this language acquisition device, and you see your little brain up at the top there. And so they process it and they try to understand it, and if it's successful, what happens is that it comes out as production. It comes out as competence. So this is kind of the process. Now, if we put up the barrier, if we put up the wall, if we put up an effective filter, what happens is we prevent that input from even getting to the device. And this is what we're trying to combat here. Making our students feel comfortable, making them feel successful, so that we don't have problems with the effective filter. All right, so when we look at the effects of the effective filter, when we have lower effective filters, we have students that have less anxiety, they feel accepted, they're comfortable, they're not afraid of making mistakes, they're motivated, they have confidence, the teacher encourages them, and then what happens is that the acquisition flows freely and easily in this learning environment. When students have a raised effective filter, they feel stressful, they feel stressed, they feel alone, they're uncomfortable, they fear being made fun of, they could just be ambivalent, they just don't care. Lower self-confidence, poor self-esteem, the teacher isn't doing what the teacher could do to encourage, maybe the teacher is ambivalent, and so the acquisition of our knowledge is impeded, it's interrupted, it's stifled. So we're always working to combat this idea of the effective filter. So Krashen said, and I think this is very, very poignant, that the input hypothesis, which is another hypothesis, and the concept of an effective filter define the language teacher in a new way. The effective language teacher is someone who can provide input, of course, and help make it comprehensible, of course, but in a low anxiety situation. So we need to care as teachers for the best acquisition of the new language in our students, we need to care about how they feel, honestly. We have to care about if they're comfortable, if they're relaxed, and if they are feeling confident in the learning environment. So, a couple things. Both cognitive and affective factors influence our learning, and we need to develop both domains in our students because they do complement one another. And we need to know how these affective filter mechanisms work, and we need to address them in class so that we can remove those barriers in our students. And as I've said a couple times, this is something that is going to vary from student to student, and it's going to change because all the students are different. So this is something we have to put a little thought into, and it might take a little extra time, but the payoff is going to be very, very worthwhile. The variance in learning, and I think this is interesting for us here in Texas, because all your students are now in a different situation. For instance, are your students learning English in an English-speaking country or in a non-English-speaking country? That's going to affect their comfort level and how they view the language, whether they view it as necessary or important. Are they learning with other students from a variety of cultures or just their own? For instance, in Mexico, all the students are learning in a non-English speaking country, but they're learning with other Mexicans. Here at Lamar, you don't have that situation, actually. They're learning in the United States, which might be a plus, but they're learning with students from other cultures, which can make them feel less comfortable, less supported by their classmates, psychologically. What culture does the teacher come from? Also interesting, especially as an American English teacher in Mexico. Often I'm the only American in the room. And so how do they view me? Often, and I'll tell you this is very interesting, they view me as the expert, someone who just knows English. But when the teacher is Mexican, they have this camaraderie with the teacher because they see the teacher as a Mexican who is proficient in English. And that's something that they can aspire to. They can never aspire to be an American because they could, obviously, but they weren't born in the United States like I was. And that's totally psychological on them for seeing it that way. But when they see a Mexican teacher, they have a closer connection, which I completely admire and respect and envy, but it's a really nice thing. And so the Mexican teachers can be real role models for their Mexican students, or whatever country we're talking about. And then finally, are learners using the language in class with other students in a social setting or in a professional setting? What is the purpose of the language learning, and how are they using it? I can speak again from my experience. When I have to give presentations in front of Spanish-speaking teachers, sometimes in Spanish, it's something I really, really don't like doing. I feel very uncomfortable doing it because it's a professional setting. But I use Spanish socially very easily, talking to people or talking to friends about whatever is maybe not crucial or important or technical. But when you get into a technical vocabulary situation, things totally change. So thinking about your students in their situations too. So we have to, as instructors, we have to understand that and help our students understand that this process of creating a second language ego is a necessary process, and that it is a process, that it's not going to happen overnight, that they need to develop their confidence and their comfort level in this learning environment, not just with vocabulary, not just with grammar, but in the learning itself, and that the students can manipulate this new ego to their own advantage. All right, so here, because this is a shorter version of the talk, I have 5 simple tips that I thought, just really, really easy things. Again, this is very, very basic. We're just in the starting point of this idea of the language ego. But first of all, have students use a different name in class. The very first second language that I studied when I was like 12 or 13 years old is I took German classes. My family heritage is German, And I'm from Wisconsin, where there's a lot of German heritage and German influence. And I just thought, well, this is obvious. The other option in my school was Spanish, and I didn't even consider it. And one of the things my teacher did, and my teacher, she was really good. She had us pick a new name. And looking back at it, I thought, well, I guess that's, it's kind of fun and it makes us feel more German. And now looking at it from this point of view, it's fun and it makes you feel more German. Actually, it's really more profound than I gave it credit for. It's fun, which means I am creating a new identity in this other language, and it made me feel more a part of that other language. So although it seems very superficial, it was actually very psychologically profound. All right, secondly, making sure tasks are challenging but not overwhelming. This is something we've heard a million times. Students need to be challenged but not over-challenged. They need to be able to accomplish and feel that they have accomplished. This third one, this is really interesting, I think, for us in language classes. If language is how we express ourselves and our thoughts and our feelings, how much opportunity do we give our students in English class to express their thoughts and their feelings? We do this a lot in other classes, in history classes or social studies classes. People talk about how they feel and their opinions. But in language classes, we spend a lot of time just practicing first conditional, we practice future perfect, and everything is disconnected. But if we can get our students, if we can give them an opportunity to express something personal in our language class, it starts connecting who they are on the inside with the language that they're using as their expressive vehicle. The fourth one, negative emotions can literally make us sick. So we need to do our best to control those inside the classrooms so that we are developing positive emotions and students feel good about themselves. And then finally, create a safe space and celebrate mistakes. Most of our students don't want to speak, especially adult students. They don't like speaking because they don't want to make a mistake. With adult students, what is interesting is that they think they know better, and this is very possible, what is correct and what is incorrect. So they prevent themselves from saying something that could be incorrect. And younger students, they don't have that definition, so they talk and they make mistakes and they don't care as much. But this idea of making mistakes, we know this as language teachers, this is really important, because how do you learn if you don't make a mistake? As a wise man once said, I shouldn't call him a man, as a wise being once said,
Heeded my words not, did you? Pass on what you have learned. Strength, mastery, but weakness, folly, failure also. Yes, failure most of all. The greatest teacher failure is. Repair what they grow beyond. That is the true burden of all masters.
Interesting. So much to take away from that. But the greatest teacher failure is. And if Yoda says it, well, it's true. Okay, so now this idea of failure. This brings us to this model of second language acquisition by Gardner. This idea that achievement in a second language is dependent on two different variables. One is language aptitude, which we have mentioned, this idea of cognitive process, and then also motivation. And when we talk about motivation, we're talking about any features in our learners' attitudes, in their beliefs, their ideals, their expectations, as they relate to learning this second language specifically, their interest in the foreign language or in foreign languages, and how they view the community, the society, the culture of that language. So it all comes together here. And so now, talking about motivation in our students, how to help them lower this affective filter. create more permeable language boundaries, like ego boundaries. And so motivation is this combination of deciding to do something, the effort we put into it, and our persistence in it. So the why we decide, the how hard we pursue it, and the how long we're willing to work on this. So this is kind of motivation. Motivation requires that people see a relationship between their behavior and their desired outcome, what they hope to accomplish and how they are working to accomplish it. So we often, as educators, we talk about two different types of motivation. Let's see, I'll put this one out there. Do you remember what they are? Usually as teachers, we talk about two different kinds of motivation.
Positive and negative?
No. Anyone?
Internal, external.
All right, and what's the internal and external, exactly? What?
Intrinsic and extrinsic.
Exactly. We often talk about intrinsic and extrinsic. And extrinsic, this is, if we focus on extrinsic, it's the external motivation, exactly. So this is the motivation outside that is propelling us to do something. There's some sort of goal, there's some sort of reward that influences our behavior. And the difference, as we'll see, is that this doesn't come from within. This is something that our parents give us, or our teachers give us, or society imposes upon us. And the thing about external communication is that it's really, really powerful. External communication or an extrinsic communication will override intrinsic communication often. If you look at it can create negative pressurized atmospheres. Students often, when there's extrinsic communication, they look for the easiest way to accomplish it so that they can finish it sooner. They can get the process over with. And then often, once we've obtained the reward, that's just kind of it. I've won. What's the point in continuing? And extrinsic motivation, think about money in our society. Our society functions on money. Many of us, not us here because we're teachers, but many people in society, they go to a job or they go to 2 jobs or 3 jobs that they hate. And why do they do it? Because they get paid, because they need the money. So it's very, very, very powerful. The other type is intrinsic motivation. This is more internalized motivation. This idea comes from within, this idea of I'm doing this because I like it. I'm doing it because it makes me feel good. I like the challenge. I like being a part of this culture. So there's no end game, but there's still this point of reference within ourselves. That there's something about it inside me that's motivating me to do it. It's my choice. I feel like it makes me feel good. I feel proud. I feel self-confident, and something about my life will improve because of this situation. So with intrinsic motivation, the experience itself becomes its own justification. And this richer, more fulfilling experience will lead to better conceptual understanding, greater creativity, and improved and more flexible problem solving. But there's an issue, well, there's a couple issues with this model, this intrinsic-extrinsic model of motivation. The main thing is that it's really focused on fixed points. Even with intrinsic motivation, there's some point in the motivational process that we're focusing on. And it ignores this idea of motivation over time. And accomplishment needs to take time, so motivation needs to progress over time as well. And when we talk about our students, we can't say our students are very motivated or very unmotivated because it changes literally from day to day or from hour to hour. Our students just have different attitudes depending on what we're teaching. If we're doing a grammar day or if we're doing a day devoted to a certain topic that they find interesting or they find uninteresting. if it's the beginning of the year or the end of the year, that's going to change their motivation. Or if it's December, it's going to change their motivation too. And what activities we're doing with them. So once we acknowledge the development process of motivation, we discover that there are different stages. First of all, this idea of generating the initial motivational impulse, where we set our goals and our objectives. This motivation maintenance and protection. So keeping the motivation going while we're trying to accomplish our goal, and we keep appraising ourselves and see how it's going. And then finally, this positive retrospection, looking backwards, evaluating the process and thinking about what's next. If we acknowledge that this is a process that takes place over time, we're going to give ourselves a big advantage with this idea in our classrooms. Now, the question we need to ask ourselves, and this is in general, is never how can I motivate? But as teachers controlling the classroom environment, how can I create conditions in which students will motivate themselves? If I motivate my students, I'm creating extrinsic motivation. If students can motivate themselves, then this idea of creating motivation becomes unnecessary because the impetus is there. So if we think about the ideas now, how can I adapt this process to my classroom, and how can I work to cultivate a motivational environment in the classroom? So if we take these three ideas, generating initial motivation, maintenance, and then retrospection, in the classroom it's really helpful to add one idea before we start as the teacher, and this is creating a supportive environment in the classroom. And now, if we look at this, we see that it's a process over time, but it's also very linear. It's a straight line that goes from a beginning to an end, which I think is also not quite accurate. So I'm gonna change my little representation here and see that although we do have a starting point in some respects, it's really a journey that keeps recycling on itself. So first of all, this idea of establishing supportive conditions in the classroom, this is just something that takes a little conscious thought on the part of the teacher, but the teacher needs to be constantly enthusiastic and supportive. The teacher needs to develop these relationships with individual students. The teacher needs to set expectations and explicitly tell the students what they are, providing an agreeable and supportive atmosphere physically and emotionally. Cohesion among classmates is nurtured and developed, and classroom norms are formulated with student input. Students participate in this idea of what is appropriate, how learning happens, and what any goals are. And if students are involved, they feel like this is less imposed upon them and more agreed upon among everyone. So we create this a supportive environment in our classroom. And as teachers, we help our students generate this internal motivation. I love this. Young children, as we know, are naturally motivated. They go around the house when they're 2 and 3 and 4 years old, and they touch everything, and they put everything in their mouths, and they experiment, and they learn things on their own. They don't know how they're learning, but they're learning. And then when they're 5 or they're 6, we stick them in a classroom, and they're expected to conform to the norms of the classroom, the hours, the curriculum, the days, and we've taken away all this freedom and independence, and they have to learn how to learn in this situation, which is by definition unnatural for them. So what can we do? Develop interest in the language and in the culture with challenging and satisfying aspects, creating positive attitudes, and connecting language learning to things that they already find interesting and relevant to themselves. Advocate a positive attitude with culture, speakers, and influence. Highlight similarities in the cultures. It's always fun to look at the differences in cultures. But if we look at the similarities, then it makes our cultures seem less separated, which helps me shrink my ego boundary. It makes me feel more comfortable in the other culture. And then showcase the practical and pragmatic benefits of learning L2 instead of focusing on, well, now you know how to write in the passive voice. Telling your students, well, now we've learned this so that when you are in this situation, you can express this idea or this feeling, making things practical and relevant. So then we have to maintain and protect the motivation that we have started developing in our students. Variety of tasks in our classroom, and when I talk about variety, we're talking about variety in topics, variety in skills and systems, interaction patterns, how involved students are, how long these tasks last, making sure that we're approaching things from the point of view of our students and the students find them interesting, intriguing, maybe funny, competitive among our students. And then finally, continuing to develop goal setting, always moving that goalpost forward, developing the psychological, the positive psychological factors in our students like self-esteem and confidence, image, motivation, working on learner cooperation and metacognition. The students understanding their own learning process and how they work best. And then finally, when we get towards the end of a goal situation, and maybe we've attained a goal, looking back and seeing how we can keep moving forward and using that information to move forward. So we give our students tools to help them learn from past failures and successes. We give them feedback and we keep it objective, no judgments. We just help our students understand the learning process, keeping attitudes positive, and we celebrate successes while trying to avoid this idea of extrinsic rewards. So celebrating successes, hopefully in a way that isn't necessarily, like monetary or some physical thing that seems like a reward or an award, but making our students feel successful in the learning process, in their learning development. All right, so this is the process, kind of as if you see it this way in the classroom, we see that's this unending task in the classroom, but this is how we really should function in real life too. So it's relevant not just inside the classroom, but also outside the classroom. But it's this cycle that keeps repeating, and we keep finding new ways to begin a motivational cycle. And maybe sometimes we reach the end of that, but we use that to propel us into the next stage. Okay, so coming to the end, let's recap. This idea of the language ego is this assumed identity that is governed in part by the comfort level in the linguistic system, but also in the culture of this second language. Ego boundaries can be made thinner and more permeable by lowering inhibitions and promoting empathy. The affective filter is this discomfort, this emotional discomfort related to the learning situation. So this can affect a student's learning as much as cognitive issues can. Negative factors can be countered by conscientiously and correctly increasing learner motivation. Motivation should be thought of as an ongoing developmental process, not a fixed point or a moment of achievement or a moment of lack of achievement. An internal motivational mechanism promotes autonomy, which in turn further develops motivation. And then finally, autonomous and motivated students nurture healthy language egos. So everything comes full circle. This idea of creating a language ego, helping our students motivate themselves. They work with and complement each other in this learning process in the classroom. This, for me, was a really, really fascinating topic to look into. again, it seems from anecdotally talking to most of you, we all speak more than one language here, or we have tried learning a second language. So we know what it's like. We know what our students are going through. And especially as a native English speaker, this is something that honestly not a lot of Americans understand, because English is the language most of the world is trying to learn. More than 1.5 billion people around the world are trying to learn English. So for those of us who were born knowing English, we feel that that's enough, and so we don't try to learn a second language. So we're missing out on this perspective that our students already have. So thank you. What? Oh, now she's very happy, Sophia Vergara. But thank you for the opportunity. Thank you to Alex, my friend Alex, Dr. Monceau, for inviting us today, and that's I think having a comfortable. What's the word? Cozy crowd today is great, and I know that this is going to expand further and further into the future, and this is a really, really worthwhile event, especially in this part of the country. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to the rest of the day. Thank you.
Maybe if anyone has any questions before you run away.
I'll just run faster.
Okay. Well,
Will it be PowerPoint? We get a copy of PowerPoint?
so good question. We're recording the session. It's streaming live and embedded on the website, but we're also recording. So I will, permission granted, I will load that video so you can come back to the website and see it, replay it, and if you need to ask questions later on, you'll be able to contact him and ask questions later.
PowerPoint, hard copy?
I'm not, no,
In my situation, I can't because of the company I work for.
yeah. But you'll have the video.
Yeah, you practically have it.
Yeah, so.
Just
Good.
had a comment about what you were saying. I was remembering some quotes that I read, and one of those is that speaking our second language is having a second soul.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the nice thing about that is to try to bridge those souls so that you feel like a complete person instead of a different person in the other language. So yeah, I understand that.
And actually, when I was learning English in Mexico, I remember my classmates saying that the teacher had a different tone of voice when he spoke English or Spanish. So they preferred him to be speaking English because his voice was, I believe, I don't know, stronger or something. But they were mentioning that.
That's very interesting.